Celestius Ex was brought to my attention in the comments section of my BESM D20 video as a spin-off of BESM D20, a Christian spin-off of BESM D20, which it itself is a spin-off of BESM and D&D 3.5. Every entertainment medium always has a Christian subgenre, with varying levels of quality. There's Christian musical groups, Christian young adult literature, and even Christian video games. And while at the same time as acknowledging that the satanic panic happened in regards to D&D and is still something that haunts the memories of some gamers who don't want to risk yet another moral scare of their beloved hobby, I decided it'd be interesting to see how things have come along since the times of that Jack Chick comic about Dungeons & Dragons that couldn't be any further from the reality of Dungeons & Dragons. So, with all that said, today, we're going to look at Celestius Ex 2nd Edition. Celestius Ex was developed by Crown of Thorns Studios, a small game studio with only one game to their name, Celestius Ex. They described themselves as a publishing company that produces Christian role-playing games. They also stated that they were willing to joint publish other Christian books. However, all they've seemed to publish was their flagship game, Celestius Ex, and 2 splat books for it, a character creation guide, and a future sci-fi setting book for Celestius EX called Nebular X. Celestius Ex was distributed via RPG Now, which is now an RPG retailer that is a part of the drive-thru RPG brand One Bookshelf. And another curiosity, Paper Street Games, which eventually rebranded as King's Crown Games. King's Crown Games was a Christian entertainment retailer that was started up in the same year, though a few months apart, from Crown of Thorns Studios. However, the life of both of these companies was short-lived. While Crown of Thorns only lasted about 2 years, spanning from 2003 to 2005, King's Crown managed to last up until 2007 before it finally shut down for good. The artifacts of either of these companies remains with us in drive-thru RPG listings, as well as captures courtesy of the Wayback Machine. Their websites are very much like relics of the area they came from, complete with 3D animated GIFs and all kinds of banner ads that are actually unobtrusive and not annoying or malicious. But enough with this walk down memory lane, and on with the game. Celestius, as I said, is described as a Christian role-playing game, in much the same way that BESM described itself as an anime role-playing game. The initial few passages, beat for beat, talk about role-playing games and contrast how theirs is different from typical role-playing games, just like BESM did. With, of course, the obvious differences, being that they described their chosen themes in this section. BESM being about anime hijinks from the 90s, and Celestius being about the war between God and the devil for the fate of humankind. Anybody who's played Bible or Christian-themed video games from a company that specifically deals in such media probably has really low expectations at this point. And if you don't quite understand what I'm talking about, there is a trilogy by everybody's favorite foul-mouthed Dorcas Maximus, the angry video game nerd, called Bible Games, that illustrates just how much of a mixed bag this genre can be. Let's start with what Celestius Ex is like mechanically. For starters, it uses the open gaming license contact from Big Eye Small Mouth D20. Meaning, it's going to be a point vibe version of Dungeons & Dragons 3rd Edition that gives you a lot of freedom over making your character, but also a lot of ability write-ups that you're going to be wading through. To be more specific, you start with a certain amount of points to start the game, and your race and class choices cost a certain amount of these points. Any leftovers, you're allowed to use to raise different stats, skills, and even gain extra abilities. That's the rules as written anyways. The intention of these rules, however, are that only 2 of Celestius's races are expected to have any special powers: angels and wildlings, with wildlings being half-demon, half-human children unable to fit in with either side of their heritage. Another important distinction for anybody not familiar with BESM D20 and how it differs from D&D 3.5, combat skills are purchasable with character points and are broken into numerous types based on weapon groups. Which, I understand why this was included. Dungeons & Dragons is a combat-heavy game at its heart, as are its derivatives. But that juxtaposes very strangely with one of the themes of Celestius, that not every problem can or should be solved with violence, and that rather you should guide your fellow man, or humanity if you're one of the angels, to making the right decision. The final point I want to bring up about Celestius is what changes it makes to Big Eye Small Mouth D20. First, it breaks from the traditional Dungeons & Dragons stat array, using a set of 8 abilities, only 2 of which remain present from D&D, Strength and Constitution. Second, it doesn't bother with ability scores, or rather, your ability score is the same as your modifier, meaning you don't need to remember any formulas or charts to determine what your ability score modifiers are in Celestius. Your ability and your modifier are one and the same. It goes a step further with secondary ability scores. These are various things that, in Dungeons & Dragons or BESM D20, would be governed by a single ability score. Things like HP, attack and dodge bonuses, perception, so on and so forth. Celestius Ex factors in 2 ability scores for this instead of relying on just 1. This means that a character cannot excel in one area just by picking one ability. This is a design feature I personally like to see in games, ones that encourage characters to spread out their abilities. It also uses a slightly revised list of feats from Dungeons & Dragons and BESM D20, meaning your familiarity with one of the games Celestius is based on may not necessarily help you here. And the last thing of interest to say about Celestius Ex 2nd Edition is the character sheet. It is equal parts impressive and nightmarish. It is impressive because it manages to include space for every single special attribute, feat, and skill included in this game, along with space for calculating various things pertaining to it, such as its cost and its level. This was something that no version of Big Eye Small Mouth I've ever seen has tried to do out of the box. It is nightmarish because all of this extra field space makes the font very small. Celestius Ex 2nd Edition is an interesting game, partially because it's fascinating to see how a Christian might integrate their beliefs in cosmology into a fantasy world. And in the case of Celestius, they gave 3 very clear themes. The angels who live to serve God and thus must follow very strict codes of conduct. The humans who have free will and are guided by angels and tempted by demons. And last, the wildlings, half demons who have the chance to redeem themselves of their evil nature, while still being hounded by their full-blooded demonic kin. It still falls into the trappings of Dungeons & Dragons though, such as requiring a violent aspect because of the nature of Dungeons & Dragons rules. However, since violence in the real world is anathema to Christianity, what with the 5th commandment being, "Thou shalt not kill," they work in a spirit world into the setting of Celestius called the Shroud, where people's sinful urges become material, and demons tend to congregate. With this, you're not really killing people. You're killing their figurative demons. Or maybe it's their literal demons. I'm really not so sure at this point. But most interesting, it adds its own take on the D20 and BESM D20 rules, which gives it a different mechanical flavor from both of its predecessors. This isn't personally a game I'd ever run, or probably ever play, since I'm not a fan of D&D, of any edition, nor any of its many spin-offs, but it's definitely one of the more unusual cases. So, if you're in the market for another take on the open gaming license or the D20 system, at a price of pay what you want via drive-thru RPG, Celestius Ex 2nd Edition is a game you really can't go wrong with. Thanks for watching. If you found this interesting, give me a thumbs up like. And if you want to learn more about unusual RPGs out there, check out some of my other videos or hit the subscribe button. With all that said, I am Aaron der Schädel, and I will see you all next time.